All right, we're gonna be making this animation and this tutorial. It's really cool. It's very complex, but I promise even if you're an intermediate Blender user, this animation should be a breeze to follow. It's all about using curves and geometry nodes to make what looks like a simulation of cords and wires, but we're not actually doing any baking or simulating. It's all done with textures and geometry nodes. Now, if by the end of this tutorial, you really wanna learn more about this topic, I have a series on my Patreon all dedicated to how powerful curves are in geometry nodes. It's a really cool series that you'll walk away with a bunch of new knowledge. If you want to check it out, it is linked in the description and you can get 10% off if you subscribe annually. All right, let's go ahead and kick off this tutorial. We're going to import just any piece of geometry. I always use a plane, and let's get a brand new window so we can use geometry nodes here. So let's make this maybe a little smaller and switch up here to the geometry nodes editor. And we're going to start off with an object to hold all of our instances. So I'm going to type in line, which nothing is happening because I have to click new first. And then we can type in line, shift A search, mesh line. So now we have that. We can delete this. And this guy is pointing up. I want to lay him down. So we're going to get a transform geometry node and we'll just rotate it on any axis here. I guess we'll rotate here on this axis. Now this count means this is how many points we have available to us. We have 10. So let's go ahead and get an instance on points, so that we can now instance the curves we're going to use to create all of our cords and wires. So we're going to get a quadratic Bezier. Now let's go ahead and get that, plug it into instance. We'll now have 10 of them. What I'm going to do is click and drag, type in 0, and then on the Y in my case, it's going to go ahead and we can just make it as long as we want. So this is going to be the length of our wires, and you can make it as long as you want. Now right over here, you can go ahead and get these guys to be nice and close to each other. In my original project file, I had a count of 50. I'm gonna pop this up to 20 for now, so it's not super heavy on my computer, but later on we can go ahead and add as many as we want. So let's get these guys to be here, and then you can use the transform geometry if you want to. It's not really that necessary to center out the scene to your scene. Now what we're gonna do is add some displacement to this. So get a set position node right here, and we're gonna create a simple displacement setup. My cat is going, I don't know if y'all can hear that. My cat's going crazy. A simple displacement setup to go ahead and get that. So we're gonna get a combine XYZ. The reason why we want that is because I wanna actually be able to plug into just the Z. Right here, just plug into all three at the same time. So we'll replace that with now the ability just to use that. We need to get a noise texture, plug him into the Z. And this reminds me, it's not going to displace properly until we get a realize instances node, and then we can bring up the resolution right here of the quadratic Beziers to now be able to visualize the texture actually displacing our curves. Now there's a couple things here. Let's go ahead and we're going to get a math node and set this to multiply. And so this is going to be our strength slider, but notice how he kind of moves up. That's just because the texture needs to be fully black, fully white, just to kind of center him in the middle. So we're going to get a map range just to manipulate the texture. See how this says max of 1? We need to get this one to be -1, so that now when we use our strength slider, it's going to do this. So remember this being your strength slider, and then we can move on to adding a little bit of geometry to the scene because nothing's really renderable at the moment. So we can go ahead and get a curve to mesh. We'll add a curve to mesh here, and we're going to get a curve circle. Plug that into the profile curve, and you now have access to a radius. So now you have a little bit of a radius control, and we actually have something here. Now, what I don't like is all of these curves are starting from the same position, essentially. They are being displaced, but at the end of the day, they're coming from the same line, and I actually want some to come from different positions, almost like I want to be able to manipulate their origin point. So the way we can do that is by manipulating the object that is holding them, because right now it's just a straight line. I want to displace that straight line. So if I just go ahead and bring these guys over, so right between the transform and the instance on points, and we can just go ahead and I'm going to copy my displacement setup that I created. So we can take this guy, Shift D, and then we'll get a set position node, and we'll plug him into the offset. So now we have this. I'm just going to bring my scale up for more randomization, and then if you use the value, you can bring them up. Now, if this is hard to understand what's happening, I'm going to go ahead and bring this to a 0, so we just have flat wires that are not displaced. Essentially, we're taking these guys that are all together, and then of course we can displace them like this all together, or I can change their origin points and then displace them so it just feels a little bit more organic when I go ahead and switch my 3D to 4D and animate. And so that is the point. It's just to add it, make it feel a little more full and more organic, you know, a little bit less, you know, basic and computerized in a way. I can't really think of a good way to describe what I'm eliminating by creating this, but I like the way it looks, basically. Now, there's another thing I want to do, which is randomize the radius of some of these chords because they're all the same radius. And again, using the word organic, I want to make it look a little more natural and organic by having some that are different sizes. And so this realize instances node is kind of preventing a few things. So we need to do it right before the realize instances. So essentially, we need to create some randomization that we can apply to the radius of the curve to mesh system. So what we can do is get a capture attribute. And then we can go from point to instance because we want to be essentially speaking to each of these instances. Let's go ahead and get an index node. And we'll plug this into the value. And we need to get a noise texture to create the randomization. So we'll use the attribute into the vector. And then let's go ahead and create a little bit more space here. I know I'm going to want a color ramp for this. So we'll get a color ramp. And then we need to get a set curve radius. And so the reason why is if we just plug it into the radius here, you would think, oh, it should work. It doesn't. Because essentially you're plugging a diamond into a diamond or plugging the attribute into another diamond thingy. So it's right here. And so we'll plug this set curve radius and it's essentially going to act as this radius slider, but here, and it allows you to now plug in our noise that's coming from the capture attribute into the radius. And so now we can have kind of a master radius here. So let's just kind of leave it be. And let's plug this, let's strengthen the contrast of the color ramp. And then if you play with the scale, you'll start to see it kind of initiate. For some reason, I find I have to play with the scale slider in order for it to sort of initialize. And so now we have these random. Hey. So now we have these. What are you doing? So now you have random chords, and you can use these sliders to randomize their scale. And you can also use the color. So if you don't want pure black, because if you bring this all over, it eliminates some of them because black is 0 or no radius at all. So you can bring some of these in to have a little bit more control there. But now we have randomness in our curves. Now we can go into some shading. And so let's go ahead and get a set material node. We'll go over here and create a material and just grab it right there. And we can go ahead and switch over to shading. I'm going to go ahead and remove all of these windows and create this system and go ahead and grab the shader editor. So now we have this guy, and what I want to do is first go ahead and add some texture to these chords. And so what I want first, let's bring the roughness down to get a really shiny looking scene, maybe slight bit of roughness for more of realism. Let's go ahead and get a bump node, plug this into the normal, and we're going to get a wave texture and plug the wave texture into the height. And so now we're going to run into our first problem. If I bring up the scale, you can see this, and maybe if I bring it over to the Z, I think it's the Z. Yeah, you can kind of notice how these curves, these wave lines are not actually mapping correctly because they're not respecting, you know, the curve itself. It looks right in some places, but like places like this, you can see it's not respecting the up and downwardness of the curve. And that's because of the realize instances node we needed to in order to displace. So let's go back to layout and let's get a node to help us go around that so that we can speak to the shading. So let's go right over here right before we create the geometry. So we need to go right here. So this is where we created the geometry with this curved to mesh node. So let's create a little bit of space by highlighting and hitting G, and we'll get a store named attribute. Store named attribute right up here, and we need to get a spline parameter node to be able to tell the shading, hey, these are curves. And then you can plug factor into value and then just say, call it wave, and we can leave everything else default. So then now we can go back into the shading window and we'll get our attribute node. We'll type in wave. And then I'm just going to bring, I'm going to move the wave texture back to X as our kind of default settings, and we'll plug factor into vector. And you'll notice it now maps correctly. It's essentially creating a mapping for us. So here on the bump, we're going to do 0.1 on the strength, on the distance, and then on the scale, make it really big, something like this, so that switch my camera over to, my render over to cycles, and then we can look at it. It gives it this really nice looking, kind of ribbed thing, not sure what, but it's, this very ribbed, cool look on these curves that are already very shiny and interesting. So now we have this. What I want to do now is have some of these curves have a different material that has these lights passing through it, but I want to be randomly selecting. And again, the realize instances node is not going to allow the shading to recognize these individual pieces. So we have to get one more store attribute to create some randomness. So if we go back to layout, we're going to go right after the realize instances. So see right here where the realize instances node is in geometry nodes. All we need to know is needs to go right before that. So another store named attribute. We'll call it random. We want it to recognize the instances, and I'm going to get some random data to plug into it. So get a random value node and just kind of mess with your values to create something random. Now that we have this, let's go back into the shading and let's create a new material. So let's go ahead and give it some space, get a mix shader. And then we'll take another principled BSDF. We'll say we want you to be glass or make it transmissive, roughness all the way up, and then we'll plug it into here. So now we have this material with all the ribs and the lines, and we have this material that's very rough glass, essentially. So let's get a texture to randomize which one is going to assign. So let's get a color ramp. Let's get in that attribute of the randomness. So, and then plug factor into color ramp. Okay, so now you can see some random selection. I'm going to bring this over to constant just to make sure we have a sort of on-off type situation. Now you can see some have the material, some don't. And what you can do is you can kind of scatter that randomization with a noise texture, because right now you can't change it. You can only change it back in geometry nodes with that random value node. So we're essentially we're randomizing the random value with a noise texture. And so I'm going to bring the scale to like 10 and go from 3D to 4D as kind of the W is going to act as a seed value so that we can say, oh, I want some of these random here. And then you can use this to say how many. But if you do 0.5, it'll have it directly in the middle. And now some of these are going to be able to have these things glowing right through it, and some won't. So now we can actually create that. And if we go into cycles, notice we have this really rough glass. So if we bring it down here, you can see we have that glass. I want it to be rough so that the emission kind of passes through it in this really nice way, but I still want it to be shiny. So you can go to coat and bring your weight all the way up. So now you have this shiny yet rough glass at the same time. Kind of makes it look like, rubber. So we can bring these in, go to the emission, and let's plug a color ramp into the color. Bring the strength to like 10. So now you have some like this, and you can look at it in the shader editor as well. I mean, the material preview as well. And then what I want to do is take this wave texture right here and plug this into the color ramp. So now, see, this is a scale of 106, like 600, I mean. So I'll give it like 5. And so now you have this phase offset where all the waves are coming through. What I want to do is switch this over from linear to constant. And then you can kind of make them like this. And now you can start to bring up your scale. And then if we look at it in cycles, you can see how it kind of interacts with our glass. And so let's make this guy a little smaller, like this. Cool, and then you can use your phase offset to animate. But what I want to do, I'm gonna hit the tilde key and go to the top. All of these are kind of in the same line, right? So what you can do actually is get another wave texture, plug this into the phase offset, get this random attribute, and plug factor into vector. Because essentially what's happening, if I play with the phase offset, see how it's just sort of randomizing the actual wave? I want to randomize the actual phase offset. So what we can do is plug factor into vector to recognize just the individual instances. So what it's going to do now is actually randomize the phase offset on each of the curves. And then you can get a math node and switch it over to multiply add. And then you can multiply their position to make the position just look a little more random. And you can also animate right here, this add. So I just wanted to, the whole goal of this was to randomize the position of each of the waves to give it more of an organic look, kind of a word I've been using a lot in this tutorial. But that's kind of the whole goal, to make it feel a little bit more natural for the scene. So now we have that and we can animate it. So this add right here is now the phase offset of this one that we don't have access to anymore. So let's just go ahead and knock out the animation of this one really quick. So if I go here to the timeline, we're going to go with 250 frames. We like that. And I'm just going to make this bigger. And then in your preferences, make sure in your animation right here, your default interpolation is linear. And so I can just hit right here. So I'm gonna go up here to back to frame 0, hit I, go to the end, and then hit, we'll do like 20 asterisk pi, hit add, and it's gonna animate those guys in. So now we have that, and if you wanna change the color of the curves, just go to the color ramp and change that. I'm going to make it kind of a yellow. So now you can see how it kind of looks here, and then you can bring up the brightness as well if you want to do that for your scene as well. Now let's go back to layout. Let's animate the chord, these curves, and then we can light it and finish off this whole animation. So the animation is going to happen on the W here, and so I'm going to kind of get a bird's eye view. I'm going to edit the scale of the curves just for my last minute edits. Bring my W to 0, and let's animate the W. So we have our noise. I'm going to hit Shift D. We're going to get a mix color and plug factor into B and make sure we're using both of the factors. And then we have our 250 frames. We're going to go back to frame 0. I'm going to hit I on these two, go to the end, and I'm going to say 3 on the W, just to see how that looks, and then we're going to bring the factor to the right, hit I. Now that we're at the very end of the timeline, I'm going to hit I on this noise texture, go back to frame 0, and because this one was +3, this one is going to be -3. Enter, and then I'm going to hit I. And that animation is very slow, and we are at 25 frames a second, so this is what we're going to get. So let's do 9. 9, hit I, we'll go to frame 0 and do -9. Yeah, that's much better. And then maybe we can strengthen the displacement a little bit. Very cool. We like that. Okay, so now we have this. Let's go ahead and I'm going to get 50 on my mesh line. I want 50 curves. And then what I want to do now is bring them in on the Z. as close as they can possibly be so that we can get this really dense collection of objects. And so I'm going to go ahead and remove my window. Now I know I'm done with geometry nodes. And let's go into cycles. Let's get my world brightness down to black, and we're going to get two lights. Let's get one light, an area light. I'm going to hit G and move it up and over, and then I'm going to hit R twice and point it directly at the middle. And then let's go into cycles. And what I'm going to do is switch it over to a disk and give it maybe a power of 1,000. Cool, so now we're lighting it. This is how it looks right now. Let's bring that spread down to like 30 possibly. So now we have this, and then maybe bring that spread back to be about 50. So we're lighting it here, and then I'm going to just bring up the size to make it softer. And then now that we can see it and we know it's a little bit too bright, maybe, oops, that's 6,000, 600. Cool, now we have some data. And then what we can do is take this light and do the opposite. Bring it down here. And he's way off. Bring it right in the opposite direction, just kind of generally. Seem to be losing my mind here. And then we're going to make it go up. I'm going to bring it down a little bit. I want sort of a light hitting the opposite direction. So now let's look at the curves and see how they look. Nice, we have a light kind of creating a highlight here, and then a light above it, which may be 500. Cool, so I'm going to hit the tilde key, go to the right, get a camera, and then I'm going to hit Control-Alt-0, snap it to view. And then let's just kind of zoom it in to where we want it to be. And then let's do a test render. So I'm going to give myself 1920 by 1080, 200 samples. Let's see how this looks. All right, so my takeaway right now is the lighting is a bit bright on the top light. So let's say do 300 and let's render it again. All right, so this is the final piece. What we're looking at, nice curves, nice displacement. The lighting looks great. Everything looks really, really good. You could even add some volume to fill out the sort of the black background if you don't like it. I kind of like it in this case. Usually I don't. So now we can just go ahead and call it a day. In my case, I'm going to do 1920 by 1080, and then on the samples, I'll do 500. And I would keep it at a PNG sequence because it is cycles. You don't want to, in case your computer shuts off while you're rendering, you don't want to lose everything. And then all you have to do is render animation, and you'll be done. So there you go. I hope you learned some stuff. This was a pretty long tutorial than what I'm typically making, but I think there's just so much in here to take away from it. And if you want to learn more about curves and geometry nodes, check out my Patreon and the recent collection of tutorials that are released under that topic. It's really cool stuff, and you can check it out linked in my bio. Again, you can get 10% off if you subscribe annually. But with that being said, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.